Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Kenzie. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. It's a third in a series of webinars that we're doing on the SDG Compass. It's a tool to help businesses with their engagement with Sustainable Development Goals. I am delighted today to be trying to advance a slide, and it's not advancing. Sorry, technical difficulties. There we go. I'm delighted to be joined by Gabrielle from BT and Andy from the Carbon Trust, and we're going to be hearing from them a little bit later in the program. Our objectives for today is I'm going to very briefly introduce the UN Global Compact, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the SDG Compass. Then we're going to take a closer look at the third step in the SDG Compass, that's about setting goals. And we'll hear about BT's experience working with the Carbon Trust to set science-based targets for their emissions reductions. And then finally, just a couple of links to resources that we think might be useful. So on to the UN Global Compact. We are mobilizing a global movement of sustainable companies and stakeholders to create the world we want. The Global Compact is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. There's over 10,000 businesses globally in 160 countries, and there are 70 local networks around the world, like ours here in the UK, where we provide learning and engagement opportunities for Global Compact participants to help them to fulfill the commitments they made when they joined the Global Compact. Here in the UK, there are currently 530 and growing organizations that are participating. And certainly we'd be keen to have you come along with us. So if you'd like to learn more about the Global Compact, do get in touch. At the heart of the Global Compact are 10 universal principles in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And these principles are all drawn from UN treaties, which gives them tremendous rigor when you are a multinational with operations around the globe, or even just any size company really who's got a supply chain that extends around the globe, where you may be engaging in challenging markets. It's really, I think, really useful to have a supplier code, have a code of conduct of your own that is built upon universal principles. To join the Global Compact, we're looking for 3 commitments from your CEO. The CEO has to send a letter to the Secretary General committing to operationalize the 10 principles in all aspects of the business, committing to report annually on the progress towards doing so, and then finally to support the wider UN development agenda. And at the moment, that development agenda is best described by the Sustainable Development Goals. So really quickly, just what are the SDGs? Well, it's a set of 17 goals with 169 more specific targets that are sitting beneath them. These goals were developed as a result of a massive consultation with stakeholders from all around the world, literally hundreds of thousands of people feeding into it, describing the future we want and spelling it out for governments all over the world. And they accepted that, and every UN member state signed up to this Agenda 2030 in 2015, and now really we're all doing what we can to contribute to it. This slide is just meant to sum up fairly quickly for you why we think business should care about it. And starting from the left, we've got 2 prime ministers, and you can see their lapels. They've got the SDG pins, and it's not a coincidence. Even though we haven't heard a lot from the UK government about the Sustainable Development Goals, be assured that they are aware and that the goals are already influencing policy and will continue to do so in the future through the single department plans that are central to policy making. There's a graphic of the UK's Voluntary National Review that was published and presented at the UN in July. as a record of where we're at this moment. Interesting reading, to be sure, on many levels. I think the key outcome of this, though, was that it significantly raised awareness in Whitehall of this agenda. And now, since the publication, we've certainly been seeing greater engagement from disparate departments around the goals. The pictures at the top, more from a regulator perspective, it's Mark Carney is talking about the TCFD and urging companies to act in a significant way or be acted upon. And the Uber headline is actually, that one's 2 years old, but it's back, isn't it? But I really like the wording of this headline because it really spells it out. I think that companies need to be operating in a more holistic, good way, for want of a better way of expressing it. And I think we have a situation with Uber where they characterize corporate responsibility as a non-financial issue and put it in a box and didn't give it the attention it needed. And now it's become an acutely financial issue for them. The pictures on the bottom is a bit more populist. We've got Greta arriving in New York, being greeted by a flotilla of small boats with SDG sails, and the crowd photo is Extinction Rebellion here in London. But I could as easily have put a picture up of crowds in the streets in Beirut or in Hong Kong or in Santiago, where the people are effectively taking to the streets and demanding that their governments implement the SDGs. They may not be calling them out by name, but it's what they want. The protests in Santiago in Chile kicked off over an attempt to raise the cost of public transit. In Lebanon, it's a whole suite of corruption and prosperity and environmental issues, and likewise Hong Kong, and of course here in London, it's more driven by climate. The main takeaway from this slide is that the goals aren't, I really don't think you can be viewed as optional. Either the government or the regulators or the people are demanding this. And so I think it's really critical that every company be familiar with this agenda and be aligning their business models and their business practices to it. Okay. And so to help do that, the UN Global Compact and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the Global Reporting Initiative produced a tool in 2015 called the SDG Compass. And it's a 5-step change model. Step 1, starting with understanding the goals. And we did a webinar on that a couple of months ago. And so there's a link to a recording of it. And then step 2 is defining priorities. And that entails looking at your value chain, looking at the SDG targets, looking at your positive and negative impacts, and identifying where you really need to act. Today, we're going to be talking about setting goals. Having defined your priority areas, it's our view that it's incumbent upon you to set some targets and really have an impact on those priority areas. Step 4 will be featuring in a webinar on the 4th of December, is about integrating and how you integrate the SDGs and the goals you've set through the company. And on the 12th of December, we have a webinar looking at step 5 on reporting and communicating. Now, just very briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this goal setting idea. And in the context of the compass, you need to define the scope of your goals and KPI, define a base level, a baseline, and the type of goals. And I think the most important bit is about that level of ambition. And what the compass is calling for is an outside-in approach, whereby you look to a rigorous external reference point upon which to base your objectives. We have a situation now, and may come out in our talk in a moment on around carbon, where at the global level, in Paris, countries were asked to come forward with their voluntary national commitments, and they looked internally at what was what was achievable or what they thought was easily achievable, and what they've collectively come up with is well short of what the scientists are telling us we need. And really, this is demonstrating what we need is a different approach to goal setting. We need to look at first, what do the scientists say is necessary? What is that must do? And then we bring that inside and start working on how are we going to get there. And so that's really, I think, where there's a very clear link to science-based targets, which really illustrate this idea. But I think there's a real opportunity in the Sustainable Development Goals to provide that external reference across a wide range of other responsible business issues, from health and education to inequality. And I think companies that are looking to establish targets for their performance in these areas would do well to look to the SDGs and match that level of ambition, and not just settle for what seems to be easily achievable. There's obviously much more to be said about this and to say about goal setting in general, but I'm really keen to hear from Gabrielle and Andy. And so without any further ado, I'm going to unmute them, or do my best to do so. Yeah. Gabrielle, can you speak up for us? I don't seem to be getting an option to unmute you.
There we go.
Steve, I think you've unmuted everybody somehow, but certainly it's Gabrielle. I'm unmuted.
Gabrielle, can you hear me still? And are you able to unmute yourself?
I am unmuted. Can you hear me? I'm here.
If I'm unmuted, I can hear you, Gabrielle.
Okay, you can hear me.
Apologies, everyone, for...
Somebody, can somebody hear me?
Yes.
But Steve, you can't hear me. So who is it that can hear me?
I can hear. My name's Greg.
Okay, this is really weird.
And Matt on the call too.
We're having a problem with...
Oh.
Oh, okay. Is it me that's unmuted?
Yeah.
Well, in that case, I guess I'll, if people can hear me, I'm just going to go ahead. That's okay. So my name is Gabrielle Guinier. I'm Head of Environmental Sustainability at BT.
Well, it seems that I can't hear Gabrielle, so I'm going to let you just get on with it if you'd like to start talking. And I've handed over control, I hope to the correct Gabrielle. Are you able to advance the slides?
That is a good point. Oh dear. Right. How might I do that? Share meeting controls. Do you know how I can do that?
Can we message him and ask him to move the slides on?
So, can someone move the slides? Anyway, well, I'm really sorry about this. Okay, so I was just going to talk a bit about BT's climate action journey and our science-based targets. So we were one of the first companies to set a carbon reduction target already back in 1992. So we've been taking climate action for over 25 years now. We set our first science-based target already back in 2008, and that's before people were even talking about science-based targets. Our target at that time... So our target... Maybe somebody could go on mute, whoever that is. So our target was to cut our carbon emissions intensity by 80% by 2020. And we actually achieved that target 4 years ahead of schedule in 2006. So at that point, we decided to be even more ambitious. And I'm very proud to say that BT was one of the first companies in the world to set a science-based target aligned to a 1.5 degree pathway. And that target now means that we're going to reduce the carbon emissions intensity of our business by another 87% by 2030. And following the publication of the IPCC report, we've also pledged to become a net zero emissions business by 2045. Just a comment on target setting. To BT, that has been incredibly helpful in driving transformational change within our business. And part of the reason why we met our 2020 target early was just that it unleashed innovation within the business and further ambitions to try and meet it. So it was very powerful in that sense. But by setting these targets, we're not sending a signal internally to change our business, but also externally to indicate to the wider market and to policymakers that we're looking for supply of innovative low carbon solutions. So I think, for example, if we look at renewables and if we look at RE100, the fact that so many companies have now signed up to be purchasing 100% renewables has really changed that whole market. We started to talk about ambition loops, and ambition loops where businesses provide support for bold policies and where policymakers adopt measures that drive even further action by businesses and around. And I think that's really critical in how to get to net zero. I just wanted to point to one more thing on this slide. So if you look at the middle box in 2013, we set what we call our net good or net positive target, which is around BT helping our customers reduce their carbon emissions by at least 3 times the end-to-end impact of BT's business. So what exactly does that mean? It's the ratio. If we look at the 3 in the ratio, we add up the emission savings from services like video conferencing and vehicle telematics. So, for example, what we're doing today, we're obviously saving carbon by people not having to travel to meet each other in person. And we have that in the 3 ratio, and then in the 1 part of the ratio, we have the emissions from our operations, from our supply chain, and from customers using BT's products and services. When we launched this target in 2013, we were just at a ratio of about 1 to 1. Right now, we're at 2.6 to 1, and the revenues associated with these products and services are actually worth about £5.5 billion, or 23% of total revenues. So again, that has been an opportunity for us as a business to, I think, move away from carbon and carbon emissions reductions to just being something that's in the CSR department to also be a revenue opportunity for BT. But I'm now going to, just one more point about having these carbon reduction targets, and that's, it does make sense for our business because it's also a cost saving. Through reaching our targets, we've saved almost £300 million through our energy efficiency programs in the past decade. But now I'm going to hand over to Andy Stevens, who's going to talk about science-based targets, what they are, and how BT worked with the Carbon Trust to come up with our targets. Over to Andy.
Okay, hi, Andy Stevens here from the Carbon Trust. I think if we can move to the next slide, I don't know if Steve can still hear us or not.
We'll get
anyway,
there.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, it would be useful to just sort of introduce what science-based targets are. So a lot of you will probably be familiar with them as a principle. Very simply, they're what's in line with what the climate science says is needed to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And those are to keep global warming to either well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So another way of looking at it is it's what, for a company, it's what is its share of the global carbon budget. So the principle is very simple, and that's really, I think, why the whole concept in the last few years has got a lot of interest and attention, because it very simply says, as a company, I am doing my part with what is needed for the world to be on track to meet the Paris goals. So this Science-Based Target Initiative was set up by WRI, CDP, WWF, and the UN Global Compact, and has set up a sort of setting science-based targets which companies can follow. And so that was set up originally with some sort of criteria, and periodically the Science-Based Target Initiative review what the current science is saying, where we are globally on the trajectory to meeting this, and then review their criteria in the light of that. So the chart on the right there is again, you may be familiar with this or similar charts. This is from the Climate Action Tracker, and it's basically showing the scale is the time period along the bottom, so years up to the end of the century, and the y-axis is annual global carbon emissions. So the grey plume at the top is what will happen with business as usual. So if we don't take any action, if we just carry on as we are, emissions will continue to rise, and we'll end up with a world which is about 5 degrees warmer than it was before pre-industrial eras. Then the next plume, the blue colour, is what current policies are projecting. So that's what countries have already committed to in terms of what their current policies are, and that's still giving us about 3.3 degrees of global warming. And then just below that is what the pledges that countries have already committed to and targets that have set, which is bringing us still way above what's needed and only just below 3 degrees of warming. And then the yellow and green lines, which are going dramatically down towards zero, are what are needed for the Paris Agreement for the 2 degrees and 1.5 degree scenarios. So a science-based target is following those trajectories, and basically it's saying for a company, that's the proportion that I need to follow. So the next slide shows us how the methodologies that the Science-Based Target Initiative have developed, which basically make that translation from what's needed globally to what's needed at a company level. And there are a number of methodologies that have been developed and used by different companies. These are probably currently the two most common and the ones that are sort of preferred by the Science-Based Target Initiative. So the absolute contraction is simply, is what it says. You say, where are we now? What's the percentage reduction that we need to be in line with global science? And that gives us a pathway to meet that target. And typically, companies are sort of setting targets out for about 10 to 15 years. The Science-Based Target Initiative requires that it's a medium-term target to meet with their criteria. And the Science-Based Target Initiative updated its criteria at the beginning of this year, and it is going to review that annually. So from the beginning of this year, the companies can either set what they term a well below 2 degrees scenario or a 1.5 degree scenario. And the 1.5 degree scenario equates to 42% reduction over 10 years, or equivalent of rough 4.2% per year. And then the chart on the right is a sectorial approach. So some sectors, there have been specific trajectories developed specifically for those sectors, primarily for ones that were sort of carbon-intensive industries like the steel industry or the electricity production or cement production or the transport sector, and where they've been able to set effectively a mean sort of approach for the sector, so an average approach for the sector on an intensity basis. So if it's cement, then it would be per tons of cement produced, the amount of CO2 per ton of cement. And then you can, if you're a cement producing company, you're either currently your carbon intensity is either above that or below that average line, and then you converge for the whole sector on what the sector requires out to the target period, which in the sectorial approach, the end target is 2050, but as I say, companies will set their interim target out typically to 2030. So those are the primary methodologies that we used. When we were doing this work with BT, it was 2.5 years ago, so it was announced 2 years ago, not quite. And at that time, there wasn't a 1.5 degree scenario developed. The IPCC report on 1.5 degrees hadn't been published, but BT, being very ambitious, wanted to set a 1.5 degree target. So basically, they asked us to develop that trajectory and then set a target based on that. So we used what was published at the time. There was basically one scientific paper which has fed into the IPCC report. We developed a trajectory for that, and then developed a slightly different methodology to these two, which was to be consistent with the original science-based target that BT used, as Gabrielle mentioned earlier, that they set in 2008. So yeah, I think if we move on to the next slide, and we can tell you exactly what that target was. Yeah. So it is a target aligned with 1.5 degrees, and as I mentioned, so that the methodology is what's called the climate stabilization intensity methodology. But what it is basically it's an intensity target against a financial metric, so gross value added, and you can see there that's the wording of the target that Gabrielle's already mentioned, at 87% intensity target for the year 2030 against a 2016-2017 base year. And also as part of that is a supply chain target. So, and the Science-Based Target Initiative requires companies where they have significant Scope 3 emissions to also set a Scope 3 target. And the majority of companies, that's a requirement. So, and BT, the target they looked at was again, for them, it was sort of looking at the biggest part of their scope 3, which is supply chain, and looking at what a global trajectory would be compatible with that over the same time frame.
I think next slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned RE100 previously. I think how we've been able to reduce our carbon emissions has been driven by our purchasing of renewable electricity. We are one of the largest buyers of renewables in the UK, and now 100% of the electricity that we directly purchase from energy suppliers in the UK comes from renewable sources. If we look at how we're going to get to our 2030 and 2045 targets, firstly, again, it is around renewables because we're only at 87% globally. So there are certain markets that we need to figure out how we get to 100%. Secondly, BT has one of the UK's largest fleets. We have around 30,000 vehicles. So we need to change those vehicles from diesel to become electric or low emissions vehicles. And of course, to go with that, we also need a national charging infrastructure. And our third challenge is around how we heat our buildings, and we need cost-effective options for that. I mentioned ambition loops previously and working with policymakers, and I think having that support from government policies will be critical for us going forward in how we're going to meet our targets. I think, Steve, that's it from myself and Andy at this point in time.
Thanks very much, Andy and Gabrielle, and I'm really sorry that I couldn't hear the first part of your presentation. So I'd certainly like to extend the invitation to anyone listening. If you'd like to type a question into the chat, that would be great, and we can do our best on that. I have a couple of questions, and I hope it's not stuff that you covered while I was in the blackout. So if I may, we're hearing more and more about net zero. How do you see that fitting in with science-based targets? Does it supersede? Do you see them as complementary? How do you see that connection?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a very good question and very topical. So the Science-Based Target Initiative, as you say, in the UN Global Compact have set a pledge for companies to sign up to be net zero, and are currently going through they've a draft document defining what net zero is. The Carbon Trust has sort of contributed to that debate. We put out a blog a couple of weeks ago, and for me they're very complementary. So I think the critical thing about net zero is it's a very ambitious target, obviously, because you're trying to get to zero. But in order to sort of like substantiate that ambition, you need to have a good underlying program of carbon reduction. And the best way of presenting that is as a 1.5 degree science-based target. So to me, that's the fundamental requirement. You have to have an ambitious carbon reduction target aligned with 1.5 degree science-based target. And then ultimately the whole point about it being net zero is that there may be some residual emissions which you can't completely reduce, but they will be the emissions that are hard to decarbonize. So typically there may be some industries, typically agriculture, may be difficult, maybe some forms of transport, either heavy goods vehicles, aviation or shipping, even though there's technologies which will be able to decarbonize. So it's the hard to decarbonize residual emissions, which you can then compensate with greenhouse gas removals. And our view of the Carbon Trust is that needs to again be carefully certified removals that you're sure are getting to sequester carbon permanently. So there'll be some offsets which currently exist which would fall under those criteria, but there are some which wouldn't. And that's, I think, work which will be ongoing with organisations like the Science-Based Target Initiative and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to define more precisely what the criteria are around that. But yeah, very much science-based targets and net zero are very complementary. And I think Gabrielle will add.
Yeah, so just from the BT perspective, so we have a policy of not offsetting, which is why we have this target for 2030, which is not a net zero target. It's to reduce by 87%. But as we get to our target of 2045 at net zero, there will be emissions, just like Andy mentioned, that we will look to offset, for example, around air travel and some diesel backup generators that we as a telecoms operator have.
So that's really interesting. Could you say, we've got an interesting question from Greg in the chat, but I'd be really interested to hear just a little bit more about the no offsetting policy and what's driving that, because obviously that offsetting is in some quarters quite controversial. And I think certainly Andy's point is that around some of the uncertainties relating to that. Could you share a little bit about how you arrived at that policy?
Yeah, sure. I think from my point of view, I've just really wanted to focus the business on carbon reduction and carbon efficiencies. So I haven't wanted, and I guess, this is a personal point of view from me, I haven't wanted to distract the business or have them get away from not focusing on carbon reduction by saying, oh, well, never mind, we're going to buy offsets for that. So for me, it's just been about what can we really do in our sector, but then granted to say that, we are a technology company, we are not a cement company, we're not a steel company, we're not in agriculture. So I think for us, there are solutions out there, and I do think that what we're trying to do is leading to innovation in our sector and in our supply chain.
Well, that's actually a nice segue to Greg's question. Can
yes,
you see that?
I know. I saw that. Greg, so you asked if we measured how many of the innovations that help meet the targets were achieved using partners, especially startups. So I don't have a specific answer to that. BT has 16,000 suppliers, direct suppliers actually. Because supply chain is our biggest end-to-end carbon impact, we do a lot of work with our suppliers. We, for example, have a climate policy. We have certain policies for suppliers in selling to BT, but we also do try to drive innovation, but that tends to be for our bigger suppliers, if I'm honest. So we run something we call the BT Game Changing Challenge, which is for our suppliers to come in and pitch sustainability ideas. So it's a bit like a dragon's den about how they can make those more sustainable. We do work with suppliers also for our own operations. If we look at, for example, how we cool our network and our data centers, but we do not have a measure for that. I think that's a good point, and I think that's something that perhaps we should take away and look at, if that's something that we could start writing a bit more about. For example, this is not directly on carbon, but I was at a small innovative startup about a month ago, and they take back some of our equipment, and it was looking at how they're using bioleaching, which I was not familiar with, to recover, for example, copper and precious metals out of BT used equipment, so how that can be recovered and reused, and that is it's a small company that we work with.
There is another, and yeah, just thinking. I mean, so I mean, Gabrielle's point's right that with a lot of small suppliers, it's quite difficult to make, and particularly startups, to sort of engage them all. And larger corporations tend to focus on the larger suppliers because that's where they can have the most impact. There is another sort of program that we're working with at the moment, which is part of Mission Innovation, and it's called the Avoided Emissions Framework, where we're trying to identify 1,000 solutions that can reduce 60 gigatons of CO2 by the year 2030. And currently we've got, for this year, we've identified 100, and there's a website, the Mission Innovation website. I mean, if people want, they can send me I can send them information. And a lot of those are startups, so they're sort of very small at the moment, but the potential for the changes are quite significant. And a lot of them are, some of them are working on behavioural changes, some are working on technology changes. So there definitely are examples where the impact from startups is being looked at.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. We are into our last minute, so I think it's time for me to just say thanks very much, Gabrielle and Andy, for your contributions. I certainly found it very interesting. Thank you all for joining us. We will follow up and send slides around, and do please plan to join us for our next webinar in the series, where we'll be looking at integration with Scottish and Southern Energy. I will bring this to a close and wish you all a great afternoon. And again, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.